Get out of that seat before I have you dragged off this aircraft in handcuffs." The voice cracked through the first-class cabin like a whip, and every conversation in that narrow, perfumed space died at once. Marcus Ellison did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He kept one hand resting on the arm's nest and the other on a boarding pass that had his name printed on it in plain black letters, and he said only, "This is my seat." Nobody in that cabin knew yet what those 4 words were about to cost the man standing over him. To understand how a sentence like that gets spoken on a commercial aircraft in the year 2026, you have to go back 50 minutes to a gate at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, where nobody was watching Marcus Ellison at all, and that was exactly how he liked it. He came through the terminal a little after 11 in the morning, pulling a black carry-on with a wheel that clicked every 3rd rotation. A habit he'd never bothered to fix, because fixing it meant handing the bag to somebody else. And Marcus Ellison did not hand things to other people, if he could help it. He wore a charcoal fleece pullover, plain khakis, and a pair of running shoes that had seen at least 2,000 miles of pavement. On his left wrist sat a scratched steel watch with a cracked crystal, the kind of watch you'd expect on a shift supervisor at a parts warehouse, not on the founder and chief executive of Vantage Dynamics, the company whose flight operations software quietly ran the departure boards of 11 regional airlines, including the one he was about to board. He did not look like $52 million in personal net worth. He looked like a man trying to make his connection. A woman near the priority lane glanced at his shoes, then at the general boarding line, and stepped half a foot to the side, the kind of small, unconscious retreat people make around something they've already decided is beneath their notice. A man in a golf polo glanced up from his phone, took in the fleece and the scuffed shoes, and went back to his screen without a flicker of interest. Marcus noticed both of these things the way he noticed everything. He had spent 30 years walking into rooms where people finished judging him before he'd said a single word, and somewhere around year 15, he had stopped being surprised by it and started simply filing it away. The way you'd file away a fact you might need later. His phone buzzed against his hip. A text from Nadia Ose, his chief operating officer. Denver hub integration is signed. All 12 airports live by Friday. You did this, Marcus. He read it twice, and something in his jaw loosened, just slightly, the closest thing to a smile he allowed himself in public. 14 months of contract negotiations, systems testing, red-eye calls with airline executives who needed what Vantage Dynamics built, but resented needing it. All of it had just closed. And in 9 minutes, he was going to board that airline's own aircraft as an anonymous passenger in seat 1A, carrying nothing that announced who he was. Because that was the only way Marcus Ellison had ever learned to find out what a company actually was, underneath its marketing. He remembered why he'd built the company that way. His mother, Loretta Ellison, had spent 31 years as a hotel housekeeper in Macon, Georgia, cleaning rooms for guests who looked straight through her the way you look through a service elevator. She used to tell him, "Baby, they'll decide who you are before you open your mouth, so make sure what's underneath is worth more than what they see." Marcus had built an entire company on that sentence. He tested every client relationship the same way he tested every line of code, by seeing what happened when nobody thought anyone important was watching. He boarded through the jet bridge, and the gate agent scanned his pass without lifting her eyes past the screen. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Ellison." "Thank you," he said, and stepped into the cabin. Seat 1A waited for him by the window, cream leather catching the gray Georgia light, and Marcus settled his carry-on into the overhead bin with a clean metallic snap, slid his briefcase under the seat ahead of him, and exhaled for what felt like the first time all week. Across the aisle in seat 1C, a woman in her 70s sat with a worn paperback open on her lap, and a pair of wire-rimmed glasses pushed up into steel gray hair. Her name, though nobody in that cabin would learn it for another 40 minutes, was Colonel Dorothy Simmons, United States Army, retired, as 74 years old, 26 years of service, the last 11 of them training junior officers to make decisions under pressure without letting their assumptions make the decision for them. She watched the young flight attendant's eyes travel over Marcus's fleece, his shoes, his ticket, and linger there just a half-second. Too long, and Colonel Simmons had trained enough people to recognize the shape of a bad decision before it was made. The flight attendant's name tag read Brianna Voss. She was 29, 3 years into the job. Sharp enough to have memorized every regular flyer on this Denver route by face. And she looked at Marcus's boarding pass, looked at his fleece, and something in her posture stiffened by a degree that would have been invisible on video and was perfectly obvious to Colonel Simmons sitting 6 feet away. "Seat assez," Brianna said, smile tightening at the corners. Marcus only nodded. He had learned decades ago that some insults arrive so quietly. You could either spend your whole life responding to each one, or you could save your voice for the ones that mattered. This one, he decided, did not matter yet. Then the cabin door chimed, and the insult that did matter walked in. Preston Whitfield entered first class, the way he entered every room he had ever occupied, which is to say, he entered it like a verdict already rendered in his favor. 61 years old, silver at the temples, a camel overcoat that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, a signet ring on his right pinky finger engraved with a family crest he'd had manufactured 11 years ago when the actual family crest turned out not to exist. He was the founder of Whitfield Coastal Properties, a real estate empire built on golf resorts and gated communities from the Carolinas to the Gulf. And he flew this exact Atlanta to Denver route to check on a development outside Vail 4 times a month, always in Seat 1A, because Seat 1A was, in Preston Whitfield's private accounting of the world, simply his. Brianna's whole face rearranged itself into warmth. "Mr. Whitfield, welcome back." Preston did not answer her. His eyes had already found Seat 1A, found the man sitting in it, and something behind his eyes went cold and still, the particular stillness of a man recalculating an insult in real time. "That's my seat," he said, low enough that he seemed to think it was private, though 11 passengers heard every word. Brianna's throat moved. "Let me check on that for you, sir." Preston's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a laugh. "Check what? I sit in 1A on this flight every single time. Ask anyone." And there it was, the first small crack. The moment a system built on paid tickets and assigned seats quietly bent itself around the preference of a man with a fake family crest on his finger. Because Brianna Voss had already decided, before any of this began, whose comfort mattered more in that cabin. She approached Marcus with the careful, apologetic posture of someone about to ask the wrong person to disappear. "Sir," she said, "we may have a small seating conflict." Marcus turned from the window slowly. "There's no conflict," he said. "This says 1A," and he held the boarding pass up so the light caught it. Brianna glanced at it, barely, the way you glance at a fact you've already decided to ignore. "I understand, Mr." She paused, checking the name, Mr. Ellison. "But Mr. Whitfield is one of our most valued flyers, and he typically occupies this seat on this route." "Typically," Marcus repeated. "Yes," Brianna said, "but not today." Preston stepped forward before she'd finished the sentence. "Look, this doesn't have to become a whole production," he said, in the tone of a man who had spent 40 years turning his own preferences into other people's policies. "I fly this route constantly. The crew knows me. The airline knows me." Marcus looked at him with an expression that gave away nothing. "Does your boarding pass say Seat 1A? Preston's jaw tightened. "That is not the point." "It is exactly the point," Marcus said, and his voice did not rise even 1 register, and somehow That made it land harder than shouting would have. Colonel Simmons had stopped pretending to read. A businessman in row 2 lowered his newspaper an inch. Brianna felt the cabin tilting toward something she had no training for, and she reached for the only tool she had, which was politeness weaponized as pressure. "Mr. Ellison," she said, "we can offer you an equally excellent seat in 3C, same cabin, same service, and a complimentary drink for the inconvenience." Marcus let the word sit in the air a moment. "Inconvenience," he repeated, quietly, and something old moved behind his eyes. Not rage. Rage was for amateurs. This was colder and much older. The memory of hotel desks that asked for a second form of ID, of investors who spoke over him in his own conference room until they discovered whose signature was on the lease. "I booked this seat 3 weeks ago," he said. "I paid for this seat. I boarded when the gate called first class, and I sat exactly where your own system assigned me." Brianna's composure slipped a fraction. "No one is disputing that, sir." "Then why?" Marcus asked. "Are you asking me to move?" Nobody answered. Preston tapped his watch. Once, twice, a small metronome of entitlement. Brianna felt heat climb her neck. Because in her own mind, she was not being cruel, she was being practical. She was managing a valued customer's expectations. And people who believe that about themselves are always the last to notice the cruelty underneath it. "I'm only asking for a little flexibility," she said. "Flexibility," Marcus answered, "is the word people use right before they decide whose comfort gets to cost someone else something. What seat is Mr. Whitfield actually assigned to?" The question landed in the cabin like a dropped glass. Brianna's thumb hovered over her tablet. "This is ridiculous," Preston snapped. "What seat?" Marcus asked again, and this time Brianna had nowhere left to hide. She looked down at the screen. 2C, she said, almost a whisper. "Then Mr. Whitfield should be sitting in 2C, Marcus said, and leaned back against the leather seat as if the matter were closed, because by every rule the airline itself had written, it was. It was not closed. That was the part that should have alarmed everyone in that cabin, and instead alarmed almost no one at all. Preston's face reddened in patches, the particular color of a man who has never once in his adult life been told no by someone he considered beneath him. "For heaven's sake," he said, stepping closer. Close enough that Marcus could smell cedar cologne and airport bourbon. "It's 1 row. You'll survive." Colonel Simmons's hand tightened around her paperback, hard enough to bend the spine. She had heard that particular tone in exactly this register before. In commissaries, in courtrooms, in 100 rooms, where a man decided that his impatience was simply common sense, and everyone else's dignity was an inconvenient variable. "I'm not worried about surviving," Marcus said, still perfectly level. "I'm asking why your comfort requires my surrender." A woman 2 rows back lifted her phone slightly, not recording yet, but close, the way a hand hovers over a fire alarm. Brianna saw it and felt something close to panic. "Sir," she said, her voice sharpening now, edged with the particular fear of a young employee who senses a situation sliding out of the shape her training had prepared her for. "I need you to work with me here." "I am working with you," Marcus said. "I showed you my ticket," I answered every question. "I'm asking you to follow the rules your own airline printed on that boarding pass. What part of that is difficult?" That was the moment Brianna made the decision that would end her career, though she did not know it yet. And it happened in a single word. She turned toward the curtain separating first class from the galley and called for backup, and the man who answered that call walked into the cabin already primed to see exactly what he expected to see. Grant Holloway, 44, cabin service manager, close-cropped hair, a posture that suggested a problem in his career had been solved by more authority rather than more listening. Arrived at seat 1A with the confidence of a man who had never once had to re-examine a first impression. "Good afternoon, folks," he said, and his eyes moved to Preston first, warm, familiar, then to Marcus, cool, procedural. Something in that half-second sequence told the entire cabin everything about how this was going to go. And Colonel Simmons, who had spent a career watching junior officers make snap judgments that got people hurt, felt her stomach drop. Mr. Whitfield is normally in 1A, Brianna explained quickly, before Grant could ask a single question of his own. Mr. Ellison has the assigned seat, but we offered him 3C, and he declined. Grant nodded slowly, and notice what he did not do. He did not ask which ticket matched which seat. He did not ask why a paying customer would be expected to give up a confirmed assignment. His mind had already sorted the situation into a familiar shape. Valued flyer, minor inconvenience, stubborn passenger, and once a mind sorts a person into that last category. Almost nothing that person says afterward gets heard the way it was meant. Mr. Ellison, Grant said, crouching slightly. We appreciate your patience. Do you? Marcus asked. Grant blinked. We certainly do. Interesting, Marcus said, because no one in this cabin has yet asked the only question that matters. Whose seat is this? Grant already knew the answer. He had heard it from Brianna 30 seconds earlier, and still, hearing it stated back to him out loud in front of 11 witnesses felt, to Grant Holloway, like an inconvenience rather than a fact. It's assigned to you, sir, he admitted. Then why, Marcus said, am I the one being asked to move? Because we're trying to preserve a smooth customer experience, Grant said. And Marcus almost smiled, almost, because he had heard that exact sentence delivered in 100 boardrooms by executives trying to disguise a decision they knew was indefensible. There it is, Marcus said quietly. Smooth experience, flexibility, cooperation. Every one of those words sounds pleasant, and every single one of them requires that I be the one who loses something I already paid for. Preston's patience, thin from the start, finally snapped. Oh, for God's sake, he said, stepping fully into the aisle now, his voice rising. Do you want this to become about race? Is that what this is? The cabin went silent in a way that was almost audible, a stillness with weight to it, the particular quiet of a room realizing a line has been crossed that cannot be walked back. Marcus turned his head toward him with unhurried precision. No, he said, you just did. Preston's mouth opened. I never said a word about race. No, Marcus agreed. You didn't have to. That sentence did more damage in that cabin than a raised fist could have. Colonel Simmons closed her eyes briefly, not in shock, but in a kind of weary recognition. The recognition of someone who has watched this exact pattern play out for 6 decades and had hoped, foolishly, that it might finally be rarer by now. Grant straightened, his composure cracking at the edges. Sir, nobody here is discriminating against you. Then answer me one thing, Marcus said. If I looked like him, he tipped his chin toward Preston, would we still be having this conversation? The silence that followed had a texture you could have cut with a knife. Grant opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Because somewhere beneath the uniform and the procedure and the 12 years of service commendations, Grant Holloway knew the honest answer. And the honest answer would end this conversation in Marcus Ellison's favor. And some part of him could not bear to give a stranger that kind of victory. Preston filled the silence instead, and what he said next would follow him for the rest of his life. You know what I think, he said, his voice climbing, loud enough now that 3 more phones rose in the cabin like a small congregation of witnesses. I think people like you go looking for reasons to be offended. You were offered a perfectly good seat. You want attention, that's all this is. Colonel Simmons shut her paperback with a sound like a gunshot. Snap. That's enough out of you, she said, her voice carrying the exact register she had once used to silence a mess hall of arguing lieutenants. Preston turned on her, incredulous. Excuse me? You heard me, she said, removing her glasses and staring him down with 74 years of accumulated authority. I spent 26 years teaching young officers how to make decisions under pressure without letting their prejudices make the decision for them. And I know exactly what I am looking at right now. You don't know me, Preston snapped. No, she agreed. But I know entitlement when it's standing in an aisle, wearing a camel coat, demanding a seat that was never his. A murmur moved through the cabin. The low electric hum of a room, realizing it was witnessing something it would be talking about for weeks. The woman in row 2 was recording openly now, no longer hiding the phone at all. "Are you filming me?" Preston demanded, and she said nothing, which was its own answer. Another phone rose, then another. Grant felt the temperature of the situation shift from an argument into something closer to evidence, and it was only then, far too late, that he understood the danger he was actually standing inside. "Ladies and gentlemen, please put your phones away. There's no need to record," Grant announced, palms raised. The exact tone airlines train their staff to use to make an audience doubt what its own eyes have just witnessed. Nobody lowered a single phone. "There is every need to record," Colonel Simmons said. "Ma'am, I need you to remain seated and let the crew handle this," Grant said. "I am seated," she replied. "And I am watching exactly how you handle it." Grant turned back to Marcus, and here is where he made the second mistake of his career, worse than the first, because the first mistake had been made out of ignorance, and this one was made in full view of the evidence. "Mr. Ellison," he said, his voice sharpening at the edges, "at this point your refusal to cooperate is creating a disruption." Marcus went very still, and it was the stillness of a man who has just heard the exact sentence he'd been waiting for, the sentence that finally gave him permission to stop being patient. "Say that again," he said. Grant hesitated. "Sir, we need to resolve this before departure." "No," Marcus said. "You said my refusal to cooperate is creating a disruption. Tell this cabin precisely what it is you believe I refuse to do." Grant's jaw worked. "You refused a reasonable seat reassignment." "Reasonable for whom?" Marcus asked. And nobody answered, because there was no honest answer that didn't indict everyone standing in that aisle. "For the overall passenger experience," Grant finally said. "Whose experience?" Marcus said. Silence again. Thicker this time, the kind of silence that has a smell to it, recycled cabin air gone electric with shame. Then, Marcus reached into the briefcasette at his feet, and Grant flinched, actually flinched, a small involuntary jerk that 4 separate phones captured perfectly, and that would be replayed, dissected, and captioned across the internet within 18 hours. Marcus noticed the flinch. Everyone noticed the flinch. He withdrew a slim black folder, plain, unhurried, and set it on his tray table without opening it yet. "I want everyone in this cabin to understand something," he said, and his voice had not risen once through the entire exchange, which was precisely what made it so unbearable to listen to. "I have not shouted. I have not threatened a single person on this aircraft. I have not blocked an aisle or ignored a safety instruction. I am sitting in the seat I purchased, and I am somehow being described as the disruption." Preston made a small scoffing sound, weaker now than before. "This is theater," he muttered. "No," Marcus said, turning toward him for the first time in a full minute. "Theater would be me telling this cabin exactly what my company does for this airline." Brianna's head snapped up, Grant's color drained by a shade. Marcus opened the folder and lifted out a single printed page, a contract summary, Vantage Dynamics, Enterprise Flight Operations Platform, licensed to Meridian Airways, covering crew scheduling, maintenance tracking, and gate dispatch across every hub the airline operated. He did not wave it. He did not gloat. He simply set it on the tray table and let it exist there, a fact in a cabin that had run entirely on assumption for the last 11 minutes. "I was hoping to fly home today as nobody in particular," Marcus said quietly. "But since you've decided I don't belong in this seat, I think it's time you all learned exactly who you were asking to move." Grant stared at the page as if it had materialized out of the recycled cabin air. Brianna's hand rose slowly to cover her mouth. Because that company name was not a stranger to her, it lived in every training update, every gate change alert that appeared on her tablet without a hitch, every maintenance clearance, that let this exact aircraft push back on schedule instead of sitting on the tarmac for 3 extra hours. It had been invisible and essential for years, and the man behind it had been sitting 18 inches from her the entire time. Being asked to give up his seat for a man whose real estate empire had nothing to do with keeping this airplane in the air. "What is this supposed to mean?" Preston demanded, staring at the page with the confused fury of a man watching his own leverage evaporate in real time. "It means," Marcus said, "that you are asking me to rearrange myself around a seat that belongs to me on an aircraft that would not have left the gate on schedule this morning without software my company built." "So you sell them some software?" Preston sneered. "That doesn't make this your seat." "No," Marcus said, turning to face him fully. "My boarding pass makes it my seat. That is the entire point you and this crew have spent the last 15 minutes refusing to hear." Grant cleared his throat.
"Mr. Ellison, I think there may have been a misunderstanding."
"No," Marcus said flatly. "There was no misunderstanding, Mr. Holloway. There was a decision. You decided a man in a golf jacket mattered more than a boarding pass. You decided my calm was an invitation to keep pushing. The only misunderstanding here was your belief that I could be pressured quietly, without anyone finding out how." His phone buzzed against the tray table. The screen lit up. Rebecca Cole, interim chief executive, Meridian Airways. He let it ring once, twice, a third time, the sound filling the cabin like a slow countdown, before he lifted it to his ear. "Rebecca," he said evenly. "No, I'm not delayed by weather." He looked directly at Grant Holloway as he said the next sentence. "I'm delayed by your crew." On the other end of the line, office noise died into a held breath. "Derek," Rebecca said. She had known him 7 years, since the very first pilot integration. "What exactly is happening right now?" "I am sitting in seat 1A on flight 142 out of Atlanta," Marcus said. "The seat assigned to me, the seat I paid for, and your crew has spent the last 15 minutes trying to give it to a passenger named Preston Whitfield instead." Preston heard his own name pass through the now-funed speaker and straightened, recognition flickering across his face, because he knew Rebecca Cole, not intimately, but from enough charity dinners and executive lounges to understand exactly what it meant when a room he thought he controlled suddenly connected, live, to a room he did not. "Put me on speaker," Rebecca said. Marcus set the phone flat on the tray table and tapped the screen, and her voice filled the cabin, calm, precise, unmistakably in command. "Mr. Holloway." Grant straightened as if called before a tribunal. "Yes, Miss Cole, is there any safety reason Mr. Ellison cannot remain in his assigned seat?" "No, ma'am." "Is there any federal regulation requiring him to move?"
"No, ma'am."
"Is Mr. Whitfield ticketed for seat 1A?" Grant's eyes flicked helplessly toward Preston. "No, ma'am. He's assigned to 2C." "Then explain to me," Rebecca said, her voice never once rising, "why the founder and chief executive of the company that keeps this entire airline's operations running has spent the last 15 minutes being pressured to abandon a validly ticketed seat so that a real estate developer could have it instead." There it was, spoken plainly, chief executive, no longer whispered, no longer hinted at. A man in row 2 murmured something under his breath. Brianna's hand pressed harder against her mouth. Colonel Simmons closed her eyes, not in surprise but in something closer to grief. Because the reveal did not make Marcus more deserving of respect than he had already been. It simply proved, on the record, in front of everyone, that respect had never been the thing this cabin was actually rationing. Preston stared at Marcus as though seeing him for the first time in his life. "You're Marcus Ellison," he said, the name arriving like a slap. Marcus turned toward him slowly. "I was Marcus Ellison before you knew it," he said, and the sentence emptied the aisle of breath entirely. "Mr. Holloway," Rebecca continued through the speaker, "seat Mr. Whitfield in 2C immediately. Miss Voss, I want a full written incident report before this aircraft lands, and I want every second of cockpit and cabin communication from boarding preserved, unedited, no summaries." "Yes, ma'am," Brianna said, her voice shaking. "And both of you are relieved from first-class cabin duty for the remainder of this flight, effective now. Another crew member will take over service in this section." Grant's face went the color of old paper. "Ma'am, if I could explain, this is not a discussion, Mr. Holloway," Rebecca said, and the words fell like a gavel across the entire cabin. Then her tone softened, only for Marcus. "Derek, Marcus." "I am deeply sorry, I know," he said quietly, looking out at the rain streaking the window in thin silver lines. "I believe you're sorry now." There was a pause on the line, and when Rebecca spoke again, her voice had lost its authority and gained something closer to shame. "You're right," she said. "That distinction matters. I'll see you when you land," Marcus said, and ended the call. Preston Whitfield did not move for a long moment, and when he finally reached for his carry-on, his hand trembled, not from cold. He walked to seat 2C without another word, and the tapping of his watch had stopped entirely, along with, for the first time in a very long time, his certainty about anything. But Preston Whitfield was not a man who learned quietly. And the second half of this story is the part that made it a story worth telling at all, because he did not simply sit down and accept his humiliation. 40 minutes into the flight over the Tennessee-Kentucky border, he unbuckled his seatbelt, walked the 6 steps back to seat 1A, and leaned over Marcus, with his voice pitched low enough to avoid the cameras, but loud enough for Colonel Simmons to hear every word. "You think a phone call changes anything?" he hissed. "I have known board members at this airline for 15 years. I will have your company's contract reviewed, line by line. I will make sure every airline executive in this country knows your name for the wrong reasons." Marcus did not even turn his head. "You already have," he said. "That's the part you haven't understood yet." A flight attendant summoned by Colonel Simmons intervened within 90 seconds, and Preston was formally warned by the aircraft's captain, over the intercom, that further interference with a passenger would result in his detainment by federal authorities upon landing in Denver. A warning 11 passengers recorded in full, and that would circulate online within 6 hours under a caption that needed no embellishment at all. He spent the remaining 90 minutes of that flight in silence, and it was not the silence of remorse. It was the silence of a man doing arithmetic, trying to calculate exactly how much of his life the next 72 hours were about to cost him, and the answer, when it arrived, was considerably more than he imagined. The video from row 2 crossed 200,000 views before the aircraft had even reached the gate in Denver. By morning, it had crossed 4 million. The clip that spread the furthest was 11 seconds long, Marcus's voice asking quietly, "If I looked like him, would we still be having this conversation?" Followed by 12 seconds of a cabin, gone completely, damningly silent. Meridian Airways' Public Relations Department received 900 emails before 9 o'clock the next morning. Whitfield Coastal Properties received considerably more, most of them addressed not to the company but to its founder personally, and 3 separate investors in Preston's Vale development quietly withdrew their financing within the week, citing, in careful legal language, reputational concerns unrelated to the underlying project. The country club in Highland Falls, where Preston had held a board seat for 9 years, issued a private letter within 11 days, informing him that his membership would not be renewed for the following term, a letter that arrived, with what Preston considered particular cruelty. On the same afternoon, his own son called him for the first time in 4 months. His son, Caleb Whitfield, 28, worked in marketing for a mid-sized firm in Charlotte, and he had watched the video the way half the country had watched it, before he knew his own father was in it. When he called, he did not open with anger. He opened with a question. "Dad," he said, "did you actually say that to him?" And Preston, who had spent 61 years being the loudest and most certain man in every room he entered, found himself with nothing to say at all. Because his son's voice held none of the fury from the internet, only a kind of quiet, devastating disappointment that landed far harder than any stranger's outrage ever could. "I built everything I have, so you'd never have to explain me to anyone," Caleb said. "And now I've got 3 people at my office asking me if I'm related to that guy from the video." Preston sat alone in his study that night, the same camel coat draped over a chair, the signet ring catching the lamplight, and for the first time since seat 1A, something in him cracked open that had nothing to do with lawyers or contracts or lost investors. It was smaller and worse than any of that. It was simply the sight of his own son's face, disappointed, on a screen, and no amount of money had ever prepared him for the particular weight of that. He did not become a good man overnight. People rarely do. But 3 weeks later, without cameras, without a publicist's carefully worded statement, Preston Whitfield sent a private letter to Vantage Dynamics, addressed directly to Marcus Ellison, and it contained no excuses, no mention of misunderstandings, no defense of his own behavior at all. It read only, "I spent my whole life assuming people had to prove themselves to me before I'd extend them the smallest courtesy. I have never once had to prove myself to anyone. I understand now what that cost other people, and I am ashamed of how long it took me to see it." Marcus read it twice, folded it, and placed it in the same drawer where he kept his mother's old hotel name badge, not as forgiveness exactly, but as a record. Because Marcus Ellison believed some things were worth remembering precisely so they could not happen quietly again. Meanwhile, Meridian Airways underwent changes that had nothing to do with public relations theater. Rebecca Cole personally reviewed 19 months of first-class boarding disputes and discovered a pattern that had existed for years, a quiet, unspoken hierarchy where certain passengers were routinely accommodated at the expense of others who happened to look a particular way. A pattern that had simply never surfaced before, because none of those earlier passengers had happened to be carrying a folder with the airline's own operational contract inside it. 3 additional employee complaints, filed and buried over the previous 2 years, resurfaced during the internal investigation. Grant Holloway was reassigned out of passenger-facing roles entirely. Brianna Voss completed a mandatory bias and de-escalation training program, and 6 months later wrote Marcus a private letter of her own, one he never made public, admitting that she had judged him by his shoes before she had ever looked at his name. Colonel Dorothy Simmons received, 3 weeks after the flight, a handwritten note from Marcus Ellison himself, thanking her for a single sentence spoken over a paperback novel in seat 1C. She kept it on her refrigerator in Savannah for the rest of that year, not because she needed the credit, but because, as she too told a neighbor once over coffee, some people spend an entire career waiting for the moment they're needed to simply say the true thing out loud, and most people, when the moment finally comes, say nothing at all. 6 months after that flight, Marcus Ellison boarded another Meridian aircraft out of Atlanta, on the very same route, in the very same fleece pullover, with the same scratched steel watch on his wrist, the one his father had worn until the day he died, the one Marcus had never replaced with anything more expensive because some things were not supposed to announce themselves. There were no cameras waiting for him this time, no announcement, no special treatment engineered for the occasion. A young flight attendant he had never met greeted him at the cabin door with an ordinary, unremarkable smile. The kind you give another human being simply because they are a person standing in front of you. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Ellison," she said. "Good to be here," he answered, and took his seat by the window, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, seat 1A felt like nothing more than a seat. Because respect, Marcus had come to believe somewhere between his mother's hotel corridors and that gray Atlanta runway should never begin with recognition. It should begin, simply, with being human in the first place, and everything after that is only what a person does once they finally understand it. If this story stayed with you, not because of how it ended, but because you recognized someone in it, someone you have been, or someone you have stood beside and said nothing, take a moment to like this video so it reaches someone who needs to hear it today. Share it with anyone who has ever been measured before they were heard. And leave a comment telling me this. Have you ever stood in that cabin? And if you have, which seat were you sitting in? I read every single one.